and welcome to Hey History Teacher, a series of evidence-backed tips and advice to help you teach history at primary or high school. You'll hear from expert history teachers and university educators right around Australia. How do we teach the frontier wars with honesty, care and confidence? In this episode, we're sharing a special recording generously provided by Culture is Life, an Aboriginal-led Australian non-profit organisation that do lots of things in the education space, including developing resources. You'll hear filmmaker Rachel Perkins, leading academic and advocate Professor Marcia Langton, Culture is Life CEO Belinda Duarte, Senior Secondary History teacher Bill Lewis, and Professor Melitta Hogarth of Ngarrngga at Melbourne University. Together, they explore what are teachers' responsibilities in truth-telling, how can we teach histories of colonial violence, and how can non-Indigenous teachers approach this work without fear of getting it wrong. And you'll hear more about Culture is Life's resources developed to support teachers and students engaging with the Australian Wars. Here is Teaching the Australian Wars, recorded at the University of Melbourne.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to tonight's panel on Teaching the Australian Wars. And we are very excited to have so many people here to hear from our distinguished panel. And I would like to start by inviting Uncle Colin Hunter to the stage to deliver Welcome to the Country.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome. It is my honour and privilege to be here today. My name is Colin Hunter IV. I would like to start off by acknowledging that we are on Wurundjeri country, home of my ancestors and also home to everybody here today. I wish to pay my respects to both elders past, present and emerging, elders from all nations, especially all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members joining us here today. Wurundjeri is a part of the Kulin Nation and of the Wurrung language group. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne, across to the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek, and east to Mount Baw. Wominjeka, welcome, and I hope everybody has a fantastic evening ahead. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you so much, Uncle Colin, for this powerful welcome to the country. My name is Marek Tesar, and I'm the Dean of Education at the University of Melbourne. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. And I would like to really start by also acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which this Parkwell campus stands. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and extended respect to all the Indigenous people that are here today. I acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledges and epistemologies and ontologies in the academy as a faculty of education where we meet today. Tonight we have a really distinguished panel, and that includes Professor Marcia Langton, the Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne, the filmmaker Rachel Perkins, CEO of Culture is Life Belinda Duarte, and educator Bill Lewis. And all of this fabulous panel is facilitated by our own Professor Melitta Hogarth, Director of Ngarrngga Project, and Associate Dean Indigenous here at the Faculty of Education. Please welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Marek, and thank you, Colin, for your welcomes both to the faculty and also to country. As shared, my name is Melitta Hogarth, Professor of Indigenous Education, Associate Dean of Indigenous here at the faculty, and also Director of Ngarrngga. A bit about Ngarrngga. It's a nation-building project that's here within the Faculty of Education, along with the Indigenous Studies Unit and the Indigenous Knowledge Institute. We are working to ensure that we support educators to include Indigenous knowledge in their teaching and learning, supporting them so that they feel confident and comfortable in engaging with this knowledge. And of course, with the Australian Wars, it's really exciting that we get to have this conversation both with Marcia and Rachel, key figures in leading this work. Belinda, do you want to talk a little bit about Culture is Life and the work?
Dolk Melbourne Ngarrngga Belinda Duarte, I would like to echo the acknowledgement of country, pay my deepest respect to the Wurundjeri people, extend that acknowledgement to the Kulin Nation. As a part of Kulin country, I have ancestral connections as Jarrah and Dja Dja Wurrung country. My matriarchal country is Northwest Victoria, Wotjobaluk country. In acknowledging country, it's so important to breathe into land and the ancestral story of this place. And often in institutions and organisations, you can be in settings like this and we don't take that moment just to exhale into country and connect with the source that nourishes us as Melburnians here in Naarm. And today's gathering is something that is deeply personal for many Aboriginal people across this country of countries. Personally, I am a descendant of a child that was a survivor with 2 other children of a massacre here in Victoria, not far and connected to the Broadrim River in Gunai country. I say that as a reminder for the people in the room of how deeply personal this is for many of our families and communities. And the Australian War series is something that we were extraordinarily inspired to be able to support with the social impact work we do. But what it does do is bring to the forefront how important truth-telling is for this nation and how important context and the story of the country that we are caring for or custodians of. I want to acknowledge the women beside me, change makers that have been defiant advocates and devoted truth tellers that have constantly elevated and been absolutely committed to ensuring that truth is told in this country and it will always be visible. I'm extraordinarily blessed to be in both of their presence, and they never fail to amaze me given the journey that they have just traversed as First Nations women in the landscape of the referendum experience here in Australia. I want to acknowledge the team behind this work. There is a number of people. Their attention to detail have been extraordinary, really diligent and considered on the way in which they've built those materials, whether it's the origins of the curriculum development through Shelley and the team here led by Thara and Liv on our social impact work. We partnered with Rachel Perkins and Blackfella Films and the work of this series because we want to see young people thrive. We want to see truth told in classrooms. We're committed to that, and we're really grateful for that opportunity. Curriculum's critical. I'm a teacher by trade. The ecosystem is fundamental in shaping the future of our future leaders. The invitation tonight is pretty simple. Each of you have a role to play. You are custodians of this country, and this country has a story. Multiple stories, and the entirety of those stories need to be told. As fellow family members of the Australian community, of the oldest living culture in the world, what is your promise to the ancestors of this country? How might you utilise these resources as a step towards contributing to this country's history? And how might you activate local impact through your own leadership in the schools environment around truth-telling? Thank you. Toki Dolk.
Thank you, Belinda. We will be giving opportunities for each of the panel members to introduce themselves. But as Belinda has shared, the importance around this work about truth-telling and ensuring that it's embedded and showcased within our teaching and learning and our role as educators in ensuring that the shared histories of Australia are present and understood within the Australian education system. I did a bit of research myself prior to coming in this evening, and I found out that just nearby here on the intersection of Franklin and Victoria Street, there is a concrete slab that has the names of 2 Tasmanian Aboriginal men etched into them as a memorial. They were, unfortunately, the first 2 people to be publicly hanged in Victoria as a result of being judged as the leaders of some guerrilla warfare that happened here in Victoria. These stories are shared stories. They're an understanding around the fact that the judge who was in charge of that was actually the one who had just come back from the Mile Massacre judgments. And so there's some theories around the fact that he was looking for some sort of retribution from having to hang white settlers. The interesting part is that these 2 Tasmanian Aboriginal men were here as part of the journey of George Augustus Robinson, who is mentioned in episode 2 of the Culture Wars. These stories are things that we share and we need to know, and they're not shared and they're silenced in our teaching and learning, and how important this film series actually is in getting some of that into classrooms and into teaching and learning. Rachel, I'd like to pass to you. First, introduce yourself to everyone, but also can you share about some of the motivations of why you decided to produce these films?
Sure. Thanks very much for the University of Melbourne for having us here. Our work for the outreach, I just wanted to say that, which is part of why we're here, is funded by Shark Island Foundation. And they believe that it's very important to use these documentary tools in educational contexts, because I suppose, like me, my experience when I grew up, I didn't really get any education at school, even though I went to mainstream public school in Canberra. I just didn't learn anything, and I learned everything I knew about Aboriginality and the Aboriginal history and Torres Strait Islander history from my family. And I realised, of course, that if I wasn't getting anything in school, then no one was really getting much in school. And so it's part of my motivation to be a filmmaker, to try and restore that education that has been left out for so many Australians, particularly people my generation and older. And obviously it's changing now. But so this series really was made with the intention that it goes into secondary schools. We really intended that's where it would find its true audience in a way, because there wasn't a lot of resources like this available to teachers. And so that's why I'm here today, because we want to talk to teachers about using these materials. And so Cultures Life, has been said, has developed these resources for teachers to use in the classroom specifically, so that we give next generation of Australians the benefit of understanding their history. But I wanted to just say that part of what's guided my thinking on the creation of this series and other series like The First Australians is the work that the University of Melbourne has done around teachers, and you'll talk about that research, but it really profoundly affected me understanding the motivations of why teachers aren't teaching this material as part of their offering to students. And those findings that said that, I think there were 3 that really hit home to me. One is that they haven't learned it themselves. They haven't learned this material at school themselves, like me. They didn't learn it. 2, they're not sure whether it's their place to teach it, because they might be non-Indigenous. And then 3, they don't have the materials, and they don't want to offend. They don't have the materials. They haven't been trained to do it. So part of the work that we're doing with Cultures Life is very informed by that research that you've done. And so that's why we're here today, to talk to teachers and educators about how we want them to teach this as core part of the educational offering. And so that's why I'm so excited to be here today, because all we want to do is talk to teachers and trainee teachers, because if we've learned nothing from the referendum, we've learned that we know that a large proportion of Australians don't know anything about Indigenous history, don't know enough about Indigenous people, and the educational system can really help there for the future.
I believe it was actually a conversation that you had with Marcia that was the impetus to start this journey with the Australian Wars. So, Marcia, I'll pass to you so that you can share around the connection to the series and about the importance of how knowing about the frontier wars, how it shapes our nation and our understandings.
Thanks, Melitta, and many thanks to Colin Hunter Jr. for the welcome to country. It's good to be here with all of you. I grew up in Queensland, and as I understand it, my grandfather and his twin brother were brought in as orphans from the frontier to the original Taroom Aboriginal Reserve. That area, as Rachel came to understand in one of the episodes of Australian Wars, was a war zone for decades. And I think the experts you spoke to estimated that the death toll there was about 65,000 people. Is that right, Rachel? So whereas the University of Newcastle project, the Frontier Massacres Map, has tiny numbers taken from official records, new research by archaeologists and others pushes the death toll estimate in my grandfather's country up to about 65,000 minimum. And there are mass graves across the valleys where they piled up the bodies and burnt them. Now, I've known about this for decades, and you can't go anywhere in Queensland without coming across the evidence. When I was about 16, I went out to my grandmother's country in Western Queensland to see my grandmother. And I went to the town on the way to Cunnamulla where I went to school, primary school, and I walked into the shop to get a drink, and the same old white man was standing on the veranda, and he said, "Oh, you've come back to find your people, have you? We put them in the trees about 50 k's north of here. Love." I've known about this all my adult life, really. I tried not to tell my children about it, but when they eventually found out, they were very angry with me for not telling them. So I decided to do something about it. And when Rachel asked me to work with her, and I've worked with you on 3 projects now, but on the first Australians, I said yes, of course, and I advised on that. And I also participated in the Australian Wars episodes. And also I worked with Henry Reynolds years ago on another documentary series on the frontier wars. And I've also worked here with you, Melitta, to get the Ngarrngga curriculum established, because it's very important to me too that children learn about this. Now, when I was much younger, I was a victim of John Howard's history wars and the culture wars. Keith Windschuttle's book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, which is a self-published vanity book written by a barely qualified economic historian. It's claimed that he has a master's in economic history. I've never been able to find any evidence of it. He convinced Australians that there were no massacres, that that our people died out from diseases, and that remains the conservative ruling class, if you like, ideology, and it is ever more necessary, years after the publication of that ridiculous tome, to find the truth and tell the truth. It's been very satisfying to me to be part of the revelation of the truth directly from the records and from research and, of course, from our own oral history. And I'll point you also to the volume we published here last year, Dumbak Gub Gawana Volume 1, Truth, which is a compilation of chapters setting out the history of the University of Melbourne in Indigenous Australia. And, for instance, read Kate Orty's chapter, Dr. Kate Orty's chapter on the veterinary lecturer who participated in the Forest River massacres, rode a horse, used a gun, killed people, and then came back here to lecture. There are quite a few cases of stories from the University of Melbourne that are revolting and horrifying. Everybody is complicit, and it's time for Australian institutions, especially universities, teachers, schools, curriculum authorities, to take the problem seriously and stop suppressing the truth, because it is an actual suppression of the truth. I've been to countries where in order to understand how to do this best, such as Germany and Cambodia, to see how the nations in the 21st century are grappling with genocides. Of course, while there was the Tasmanian genocide, and there's plenty of evidence of that, I believe that there were other genocides in Australia, and the evidence will emerge, and scholars will show this to be the case. In Cambodia and Germany, the school curriculum confronts these histories quite directly and in a very sophisticated way. But in Australia, the responsible authorities stick their heads in the sand and hope that it will go away. It's up to Australians if they want to do that, but it's not my choice to participate in the monstrous lie that became the Great Silence. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcia. And I think I was just going to mention about Stanner and the Great Silence. I think that the really interesting part that was hit in the series was around the fact that by silencing these stories, you're not just silencing the Indigenous stories, but you also silence non-Indigenous stories. And just the kind of epiphany that I had of how by this being silenced, we're not actually telling the true story of Australian history and understanding who we are as Australian citizens. Bill, please introduce yourself and talk about your experience about arriving in Australia and learning about our histories.
Yeah, thank you, Melitta, and thank you very much to Ngarrngga, University of Melbourne and Cultures Life for allowing me to be part of this panel and honestly to be in the presence of some academics and filmmakers whose work I've really admired over the years. I am a settler colonial on two continents in many ways. I was born on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people in what is now called Montreal, and I migrated to Australia 25 years ago, and I live on the lands of the Boonwurrung people and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I never knew growing up or going to school in Canada whose lands I was on, whose country I was on. And it was moving to Australia and wanting to find out more about the history of this new country that I had migrated to and was making my home and building my family that I wanted to find out the full story. And it quickly became apparent to me that the story of the First Nations people is an incredibly important part of that. I am a history teacher. I teach Haileybury, an independent school here in Melbourne. I teach senior secondary, VCE, Australian history, and other year levels from year 9 and up. And I think if I'm a history teacher, then it's self-evident that my job should be truth-telling. And I think a big part of that is being willing to confront the difficult and the challenging parts of our own history as Australians. And I think that story is too important not to be told, even when sometimes as an educator, it's about being forced to confront your own ignorance, to approach the material with humility, and to be always ready to learn. And so that's really what's informed me as a teacher, as an educator over the last 18 years that I've been in the classroom. And certainly the Australian Wars as a series and the resources produced by Culture is Life, I think are fantastic resources that every educator in Australia should be familiarizing themselves with. Just to think about the context of why we are here, we have a curriculum that puts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a cross-curriculum priority. We have humanities curriculum that talks about the long history of Indigenous people on this continent, not just since 1788, but in particular, the Frontier Wars is in the Year 9 Victorian curriculum. It is in the VC Australian curriculum for Australian History Units 3 and 4 for a Year 12 study as well. So it's really important for us as teachers, as educators, to be willing to confront this, to take on the challenge. And if you're non-Indigenous, I think to walk humbly, to always be willing to learn more, and also to tap into the resources that are being produced, such as the ones by Cultures Life as well that we're discussing this evening.
Thanks, Bill. I think also just in regards to the history curriculum, you've got that field of contestation and being able to and actually critique the kind of histories that have been shared previously and against the histories that we are now sharing. Particularly around this work, and Rachel, you brushed on it, was the fact that Marcia came to you around the curricula project, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curricula project that she was leading with back in 2017 to 19. Yeah. And the kind of findings that were being found in the research at that time. But also, since then, we've done further studies around engaging with teachers, trying to understand, like, what are the barriers, what are the challenges, and why are they not engaging with Indigenous knowledge and truth-telling and the histories and cultures. We have found that teachers are still afraid of making mistakes. They're still afraid of tokenism. They're still afraid of the fact that they haven't learnt it in school, and they're worried about making mistakes, offending, and so forth. So bringing these sorts of resources, like the documentaries, like the educational resources, we aspire to ensure that educators feel confident. They can know that this story has been told from an Indigenous perspective. These resources have been developed through Indigenous people engaging with these really shared stories. Above all, and I guess because we're talking about those kind of hesitations and resistances that we hear from educators, is there any sort of advice, Belinda, around how teachers or educators can navigate this content?
It's a really good question, given all the evidence that you guys have done to prove what we probably already know, isn't it? What I failed to say is I'm a teacher by training as well. I've gone into social determinants and we now work in cultural determinants, but recognise the power and the volume of time those settings hold our young people for. The curriculum resources that Cultures Life house and have been intentionally designed to activate self-reflection, and it's not a spoon-fed experience, and that how educators actually lead that and embody that is really critical on this journey. It doesn't matter what subject it is. Who are the most powerful educators out there? They're people that are invested in the work. They're people that will have a connection to it. They will be curious and investigate and work more deeply to guide and inspire their students to want to be connected to the work. There's nothing more powerful than self-reflection and doing the work on yourself on why the resistance comes up and what is out there that can support you through that. And no doubt, Bill, in your experience as well, how you've navigated that yourself, I'd be curious about to hear, and no doubt other colleagues that have followed your lead. Can I throw that in there, sis?
I just think you have to be willing to go and find the resources for starters. You have to be willing to grab them and engage them. And look, by being here this evening, the educators in the room, this is what we're doing. We're trying to keep learning more so that we can speak more authentically. But we shouldn't be paralyzed into not engaging because we're afraid we might say a word wrong. And just if I could speak again to the Cultures Life resources, when you go and you access them online, they talk you through cultural competencies. They talk you through things that you might want to be aware of, introducing this into your classroom. There's a guide before you even dip into any of the stuff around the series about how do we authentically teach First Nation perspectives. And again, totally correct. It's not about spoon feeding or being overly didactic. It's about engaging discussion. It's about engaging reflection, both on the part of the educators and the students. So I think it is that process of, I know I use that word humility a lot, but I feel as a non-Indigenous person to be aware that these at times are not always my stories to tell. Where can I find the resources? And again, when you show clips from the Australian Wars, for example, in the classroom, it's an opportunity to hear from Indigenous voices and Indigenous academics around this as well. So in that sense, as an educator, you're not alone necessarily as a non-Indigenous educator in presenting these materials, that they're there as well for you.
And shout out to the product, my goodness. You cannot sit and watch and listen and not be deeply affected by it. Like, it's easy to do the back end piece when you've got such extraordinary work that's been created. And Rach, you were saying about the amount of mobs that wanted to share their story too.
Yeah, we called it the Australian Wars for a very specific purpose because sometimes this history is put off the side as Aboriginal history. But we wanted to call it the Australian Wars because it's Australian. It's an Australian story, right? It's part of all of it. It's the story of the foundation of our modern nation. So it's not something that you're not connected to. It's part of who you are as an Australian, this story. So I think that reluctance to teach it is I can understand it, but actually it's your heritage, right? So I just encourage people to take that on. And this is your story too, because it's defined everything we see around us in many ways. But, and I think the material, to your point, it can be upsetting, but it should be upsetting, right? Because what happened was upsetting. And we don't want to subject young people to terrible things, obviously, but this truth is tough. And what happened to people and the great injustice that permeated the legal system and in so many ways in all the colonies. So I embrace that. When people say, oh, I didn't want to watch it because it's upsetting, I'm like, if it wasn't upsetting, we would have failed in our storytelling to not get that across the humanity of what happened to people in that experience. Yeah, I just think that if you leave it to somebody else, you're saying that it might not get told, or it's part of who we are as Australians. And much of the series rests on the work of non-Indigenous historians who spent their lives doing this research. And I remember when we made the first Australians, and we were talking about who to include as academics, and Marcia said, you must include these non-Indigenous academics because they've dedicated their lives to this. They've got something to say about this. They've got something to offer. Of course you would include them. And so we've always taken that approach. There is a mixture of people telling this story, Indigenous, from a whole range, because it's a shared history. So similarly for teachers, it's something that we can all teach to all of the people in our classrooms because it's a shared history.
And Marcia, I'll pass to you. It's a great segue about the importance of having both Indigenous and non-Indigenous voices in these sorts of spaces of truth-telling. Please.
There's a very interesting book that was published, I think, in 2023 by David Marr, Killing for Country, published by Black Ink. So his aunt wanted him to find out about a branch of a family, and he discovered that his, great uncle was a member of the native mounted police in Queensland in charge of black troops, and they operated actually in my grandfather's country. So he was horrified. It took him, I think, 3 or 4 years to write the book. He went through the records, and you can listen to him on Late Night Live. He's a famous Australian. His PhD was on Patrick White. He's a man of letters, and there in his family was one of the killers. And it caused a great ruckus in the family, of course, as he's explained when he launched the book. He has nevertheless never resiled from the history, and that's what it takes to live with this history. Good luck to Keith Winshuttle and John Howard and all the rest who prefer lies, because that is not an honourable way to live, nor is it an honourable way to contribute to this nation's well-being. And the ability of our children, all children, I'm not just talking about Indigenous children, all children who are growing up in Australia, to grow up with a sense of the truth. And it's often said the truth will free you. It does and it doesn't. But let's talk about how it does. You see more clearly the actual Australian history when you know that, say, for instance, Peter Dutton's great-grandfather was in the Queensland Parliament when all of this was happening. Or I could go on about all of the political and social and legal and common law consequences of all the lying. Now, it's very important to say that none of this is to blame any living Australians, unless they too are murderers, and there are a few. This case over in WA being conducted at the moment into the murder of a child. But leaving that aside, that's a different kind of killing. That's ordinary criminal homicide. We're talking about wars. So, as far as I know, there's nobody alive today who participated in those wars, although throughout my life I have met them, I have to say. And they have lied to their families, they've lied to their townsfolk, they've lied in courts. I think, am I correct in saying there was only ever one successful prosecution, and that was in the Myall Creek massacre? Yeah, 7 of the murderers were convicted. That is the only conviction for all of the killing right across Australia in the Australian wars. Now, we say Australian wars, but some of them cannot really be classified as wars. What do you say about the incident in New South Wales where the British troops rode in and murdered women and children? Possibly it was a war. Was it part of the war on the Wiradjuri? These are matters that need to be considered very carefully. I've also asked teachers, what's the best level in school to teach this material at, and how do you teach it? So we don't want to horrify children, we don't want to traumatise them, but it's very important to find a way to tell that truth and to tell it based on the evidence and in a logical and rational way by analysing the evidence and pointing to the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence. So in that way, you teach a sound historiography. You have to also teach that civilised nations teach this material in order that it never happens again. Now, the last known massacres, there may be others, I'm just talking about recorded massacres, were in the 1930s. In the Northern Territory, in the Ngarrngga Valley, when a police constable rode out with the police and vigilantes and murdered at least 60 people, Warlpiri people, and that happened after 1901 when Australia was a nation. It didn't happen under the colonial rule, which ended in 1900. This is, in fact, the responsibility of the nation. There were also the Forest River massacres in the late 20s, and others. There were the massacres in Arnhem Land, throughout Arnhem Land, in the 30s and the 40s. And I could go on with and list them all, but I just refer you to the Frontier Massacres map of the research project conducted by the University of Newcastle, set up by the late Lyndall Ryan, who was deliberately a target of Keith Windshuttle, and for her expose of what actually happened in Tasmania, which again had been comprehensively lied about. How we teach it, at what level we teach it at, what materials we include, I think all of this is important. It's a horrible experience to teach at the university level and find that most students don't even know when the country became a nation on January 1, 1901. They throw around the word colonisation incorrectly. They know almost nothing about Australian history. Everybody knows about Anzac, but nobody knows about the Myall Creek massacre, the only massacre which resulted in the conviction of the murderers. These are big problems to consider. Both the Ngarrngga project and the Culture is Life project are working hard, consulting, finessing and making sure that this is all done very responsibly. But I say again, it really is the responsibility of all teachers to teach this material at the right level, in the right way, and the advice of our colleagues who are working on this ought to be taken very seriously and incorporated into all classrooms in Australia.
Thank you, Marcia. And also thank you for the vivid reminder that this history is not a long history. It's also quite modern in that these wars have been occurring for quite a long time. Bill, I want to go back to your points around educator hesitation. I always think it's really interesting because there's that irony of teachers and educators, how we always tell our kids that it's okay to make mistakes, that you learn from mistakes. And yet then as educators, it's the first thing we say is we don't want to make a mistake. How did you move beyond that point? A nice, easy question.
I've never been shy of making mistakes. I just think, look, for me, the social justice aspects of it have overridden my own personal hesitancy. And I think, but if I may, I just want to go to a point that Marcia made. The thing is, we know it's in the curriculum, but is the curriculum being delivered? And that's something that I would challenge you as teachers in schools. If it's not getting the space in your Year 9 curriculum, which is where every student should still be doing history at a compulsory level, if this is not being taught in Year 9 at your school, then why not? And that is a question that should be asked at department levels. And if it's from a higher up administrative decision, then that needs to be challenged. And I know that can be a challenging thing to do, but this is history that must be taught. It is the history of our nation. We only have about 500 students in the state who take VCE Unit 3-4 Australian history. That is far too small. And again, why is it not being promoted, valued in schools? And I know part of it's a numbers game and what students are picking, but I also think there needs to be a stiffening of the backbone amongst school administrators to go, no, this is a priority because this is part of our civic understanding. We've had recent research coming out about civics and citizenship. So it's not just that they're arriving at university perhaps and not knowing about colonization or the Myall Creek massacre. They don't even understand how preferential voting works. And again, these are curriculum decisions. And I'm not so naive as to understand as well that just because you put it in the curriculum, just because you teach it in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean the students are going to automatically remember it. We've all forgotten things that we learned at school. But at the very least, as a starting point, we have to make sure that material is in the classroom. And so I guess to circle back to your question about hesitancy, I don't have an easy answer to that other than to say it's too important to continue to hesitate. that it's something that as educators, and we just have to be willing to sometimes get it wrong. And again, that's where I come back to the humility, the willingness to listen, the willingness to keep learning as well as an educator, and to model that for your students as well, to model a willingness to learn about these things as we go. And I think that's a really important part as teachers, that we can be that vulnerable as well for the learners that we're teaching. So yeah, so those are, I guess, the thoughts that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Bill. Of course, lifelong learning is part of it, part of education itself. And the purpose of education is to create or support active and informed citizens. By silencing certain parts of our shared history, are we actively removing that kind of responsibility of creating these active and informed citizens? I want to ask the audience just quickly, can you please raise your hand if you have seen the documentary? Can I have you, please don't put your hand down yet. Can I please have those that are educators to still keep your hand up, and anyone else put your hand down? Yeah. Thank you. When looking at who was coming this evening, it was really interesting to see the mix of the audience. We noted that a lot were primary teachers. And yet here we have been quite explicit in saying that really this material is not for primary school appetites. But there's that curiosity around, I'm assuming that you're building your own professional development and understanding. These sorts of events and the ways in which you build your knowledge and understanding and I guess your confidence is happening all the time. I know that Culture is Life, and as well as Ngarrngga, we are constantly building professional development to actually address teachers' confidence and comfort in dealing with this. And I think comfort here is critical, because this is not a comfortable subject to be talking about. And yet, Rachel, you brought the stories forward in such a way that you could hear and still have that humility of understanding that this non-Indigenous story is also running parallel to it. Belinda, talk to me. School responsibilities, we've brushed on. Accountability, the cross-curricular priorities. We've got professional standards for teachers. There's the resources that have been developed by yourself and your team around this. Where are we going around because we do have teachers that are teaching in this space that they're not trained history teachers. How do we support them in doing this work?
I guess that's a part of the next chapter, really. I think initially the conversation and the focus that we were looking at was who was best to pitch it to, and how do we continue to build this work. The likes of both of us as partners and others that are out there doing the work to create the assets or the tools to actually bring it to life in the classrooms is critical. I don't think it's a quick and easy answer, that one. There's a range of different resources out there in the space. There's not so much resources that are actually designed and written by our mob as curriculum writers. That's, I guess, our contribution as a small not-for-profit working in the space. So it's important to actually get access, and how we continue to build the connection and the PD capacity to build those, to address the barriers and the critical research that you've been able to produce. And a shout out to the volume of people that are probably on the live stream. There was a huge waiting list to come tonight, and that is uplifting for us to know that there is that deep interest and want to know more and to build on this work. Yeah, there's work to do, and it means the most powerful work is where collaborations occur, and how we can ensure that there's the materials and the people that are at the centre of knowledge holders, informers, to actually build what's out there and create more well-trained teachers across the education system and the ecosystem. Obviously, the series itself was rated. That actually deeply impacted where it was going to be produced from a curriculum perspective. I don't know how well I've answered that, but I do want to go back to your point too around the social justice overrode your personal, hesitancy. I think that's a really powerful statement. Sometimes this work has nothing to do with you and everything to do with you. And are you going to be a barrier in that process? And how do you influence your own community of educators? And there's a number of people out there doing the work. Be connected, invest in it, partner locally. There's so many of our mob that we stand on the shoulders of that have done work to provide access to local relationships that will absolutely be strong storytellers that will share the facts and the history of those locations. So otherwise the team will kill me too. For those interested, please do log on to our resources site and register with us. There's a heap of other sites, and a shout out to nephew Uncle Archie Resources up back there. Shane, thank you for coming and introducing yourself. The Stolen Gen resources that we produce as well. But there's nothing more powerful than being more deeply informed.
You can still watch the Australian War series. It's available on SBS On Demand. Please go check it out. And also, apparently you can't do that in the classroom, so there is ClickView.
ClickView is a media sharing platform, so the whole series is on ClickView, so it's available there.
There you go. I would like to open it now for questions, and thank you to the panel for all that really strong, robust conversation. Now, I believe there's a roving mic and someone gets to pretend they're Ellen.
Thank you, Olivia. My name's Glenn. I'm a history teacher at Melbourne Grammar School, where we have incorporated this into our Year 9 teaching. And it was just such a... I don't know. It's very hard to find the words of just how much that meant to me. It finally felt like the truth was in our hands and we could share this in the classroom. I think that was something that I really discovered very quickly in teaching it, was that the boys, it's Melbourne Grammar School, so it's all boys, and that they really embraced it, actually. Instead of wanting just the clips or being happy enough with that, they said, can we please just watch the whole thing? And we did. And not all episodes, but 2 of them. And so we got through them. And I was really struck by the sort of the opportunities, I guess, that you've got of the boys. Instead of this feeling like a really heavy obligation, it was, boys, this is an opportunity for you to understand something that your parents don't know anything about. So it was a sense of an anti-authoritarianism. You are going to learn something that they don't know. And they really did get into it. It was an extraordinary experience. I was wondering, as you were teaching it, because it's a very good thing just as a history teacher, the way that you were engaging with the primary sources, and it almost felt like you were getting ready for Keith Wynne shuttle to come over the horizon of, look, Keith, these are the words of the people. This is Lachlan Macquarie's words. And I was sort of wondering if you were aware when you were making this thing, it is so worthwhile, but that what lines of attack would be coming your way and how you had to build that into the way that you were making your documentary, which was an amazing thing.
Thank you. Thank you for teaching it. That's really gratifying to know, and particularly at that very important school. So that's fabulous. Thank you. We deliberately made it. It was very challenging to think of distilling 120 or so years of history into a pathetic 1 hour, 3 hours of television. Actually, that was a big challenge. But we knew that we were going to, and as a filmmaker, you need to think about how you're going to actually make something watchable, because obviously you need to get an audience to engage with it. So we're very conscious not to weaponize it. We're very conscious that we wanted to make something in the genre of that sort of military television history that's so popular with certain demographics. So that's why we did the dramatizations, and to make it interesting and engaging and watchable. So we made our best efforts to do that. your question about knowing the context in which we were making it, yes, we're very aware of the history wars that Marcia's spoken about, and we are extremely thorough in our research and our primary sources. And yes, we wanted to show people that here were the people in charge at the time writing it. Here's the records. Here it is for anyone who wants to look at it. So we did make a point of that again and again, hopefully not too much. But I think the thing is that I found with this and other series, but particularly with this, is in the telling of the history, which I think hopefully the boys had the same experience. You're liberated by telling it. You can actually get it off your chest, you get it out in the public record, and then it's there and it's done and it liberates you. It can be a transformative experience. And when you face the history and go, yeah, that's what happened, right? It just happened. That's happened. We move on. It's happened. And so I think it's great that the boys' response was to just accept it and move forward with it, because that's what truth-telling is, right? Just to say, this happened and now it's there and now we know. We don't have to hide, and certainly Aboriginal people don't have to be the ones to carry this around as their own personal baggage. So it is a liberating experience, I think. So thanks for teaching it. It's really appreciated. And I'm glad you showed the full episodes, because that means we get a tiny royalty from it as well. So thank you.
I recently watched this series with my mother, who's over from Canada. And Bill, my question is for you, because I know, right? I think I had a similar education to you growing up in Ottawa, where I didn't know that I was growing up on Anishinaabe Algonquin lands. And I did history all the way till year 12, 13 at that point, and then became a chemistry educator. And so one of the things that is coming out to me is that truth-telling is not only the remit of the history teacher, and I'm interested as a chemistry educator in better understanding how we integrate information like what is presented in the Australian Wars. So I wondered, Bill, have you had the opportunity to collaborate with others in the secondary space from other learning areas? Because when I watch the Australian Wars, I don't only think history, I think English language, I think science. So I'm just wondering about your experiences and ways that you are moving forward with the information from this very important work.
Definitely. And certainly when you mention English, our wonderful head of English at our school is here tonight as well, because first of all, those cross-curriculum priorities, when they come into the English curriculum, they also impact text selection. And so that's actually a really important part for English teachers to be able to navigate. If you look at the VC text list for year 12, you'll find films like High Ground as a multimodal text, and that's very much connected with this history here. Some past texts like The Longest Memory or The Black Diggers. Again, Secret River has been on the text list in the past and sometimes is still taught at younger age levels. So definitely for English, I think it's very critical for English educators to also be on top of that, to be sensitive to the broader histories there. And again, if I were to circle back to the idea of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives are embedded as a cross-curriculum priority. So I can't speak myself to science, but I definitely know there's a wealth of scientific knowledge and understanding in Indigenous culture universally around the globe that we need to wake up and listen to, but also particularly for the First Nations of Australia as well. I know, for example, in the outdoor education curriculum in Victoria, it's important to understand ideas about country and custodianship that filter in there, and there's opportunities to bring in that knowledge as well. So definitely, it's not something just for history teachers. The series, and again, just speaking to the early primary and the surveys that we had primary teachers and early learning teachers coming, again, I know if you're involved with things like reconciliation action plans in your school community, that while you may not be showing this as a resource to your students, it's very important, I think, for staff development as well to understand that broader and deeper history that's part of our shared history as well.
Indigenous knowledge does not sit nicely within the silos of the disciplines. It's called a cross-curricular priority for a reason. It's interdisciplinary. And just behind you there is the microphone. Thank you.
I'm not a teacher, but I went to boarding school. The nuns didn't teach us anything about Australian history, the normal stuff. I went to boarding school with 3 Aboriginal girls, and we were quite close. And I'm sitting here wondering how you manage, how you support Aboriginal children when you're teaching this history, because it must be very hard to hear about what happened to your ancestors.
There's a lady you might want to answer here.
Thank you. I'm of Aboriginal descent. My mum was part of the stolen generation, and as an educator, I love what you've done, and I'm so proud that we're bringing it into schools. Just makes me so emotional because I never had any of that history shared, and I want my children to know the truth about what happened in this country. And all of you are Australian as well, and you should know the truth. So thank you.
And just an echo to the guides and how important for us that our young mob feel cared for, and that social emotional wellbeing piece is really critical in teaching and supporting, some of which some people still don't know that they've got black mob in their classes too, which is disturbing. That's a whole other conversation, but yeah.
As a parent and a grandmother, I can assure that it is much more disturbing to Aboriginal children who find out when they become young adults because I didn't tell them, the school didn't tell them, it's not easily available. It is much more disturbing because the work that you have to do at that late stage is much more considerable than telling a younger person in a very careful way. It's no different from teaching maths. You use building blocks and you build up their understanding over time. So I just wanted to say that in answer to how do you ensure that children come out of the classroom with this curriculum content feeling good about themselves. And there are some very irresponsible teachers who make it an anti-white thing, who are abusive, and we've heard about that for a long time, and this is exactly why we're undertaking these programs and the teacher professionalisation in Ngarrngga so that teachers can teach this responsibly to children. And indeed, it's one of the reasons why some school principals will not allow this material to be taught in schools because they're afraid of that kind of irresponsible teaching. They're afraid of uninformed teaching that isn't reliant on sound evidence. And all of that is why we are doing this work, to reassure principals, parents and teachers associations, and teachers themselves and families that this material can be taught responsibly without harming children. And believe me, I speak for myself and many other Aboriginal parents and grandparents when I say it's so much harder if you don't confront the truth and make sure that your children and, all the children around.
The truth will set you free, as they say.
Thank you. And sorry, one question there.
I'll just ask a brief question. And I was really inspired by the role of students in their leadership in persuading their parents that climate change was an issue, and very much hope that we see the same transformation. My question is about the role of parents in the school ecosystem, and from an educator's or education administrator's perspective, what can parents do in their role in terms of support for teachers? What's important to make sure that there's not a backlash, or that there are parents supporting teachers to teach this material and to counter other parents who may complain on parent-teacher night?
We haven't had any parents complain about this material to date. We've had 0 complaints. And I think that it's the evidence that we've described is just too factual. So what are they going to say? Governor Macquarie didn't write that letter to go and chop their heads off. So we haven't we have to not be brave. We have to accept that this is factual history of Australia. We've got to stand up and accept that. So I think what parents can do is ask for their teachers to teach their kids it, because the kids I know and my child, they haven't learnt it yet. And they're in a public school just up the road and they should be learning it. So I think that's the role of parents, to demand that they get adequate education on this, I'd suggest.
And just to echo that the resources pick that up through what's been produced, and a reminder around the leadership and preparation of any curriculum. Catholic schools talk about Jesus being nailed to a cross, and that's been doing it for how many years? Nobody's batted an eyelid. You know what I'm saying? An auntie spoke very strongly to me that's been in the Catholic system for years and years about how important it is to talk to this stuff.
So I, just as a wrap up, because I know and I don't want to have the final word, but I do want to say that we spent 5 years making this series, and people like Bain's work informed this history. There's so many historians who spent their life gathering all of this material to present it to you. So I really just say this series is made for educators. It's made for you. We did spend years and years doing it, and it's for you. So please take it on board and have the confidence and use this material, because there's been a lot of effort put into it, and we want to really give the country the truth finally of the history. So please use these resources.
Thanks, Rachel.
Good evening, everyone, and panel. Thank you for sharing your story and your concern about Aborigines. I'm a teacher. I'm now retired teacher. And I'm working with Marcia Langton and two other ladies here. We do have our own curriculum called ILC, Indigenous Language and Culture, and we teach these kinds of history. One of the things that I talked about in my inauguration last year about my people who was killed by Bill Harney. He was a horseman. He went around the community around Arnhem Land and killed everyone. Not everyone, but some, because some had fled to other places. It's a real long story for us, but it's also deep. And when I say deep, they are buried underneath. Because my people were thrown to a lake, to Billabong. They buried this long hole where they threw our people together into that long hole. And a year later, they came back for their remains, took them overseas or somewhere, we don't know, for scientific reasons, because we see ourselves, we are very important. All our remains, we sing to it, we dance to it. It is our backbone, and that's why we'd like to teach our children in the classroom. Some stories are being told around campfire at home, and which sometimes we invite elders that know the full story about massacre, what had happened to our people. They come along and they tell stories in the classroom to our younger children, because we want them to know, because it's a very sad story for us. And that's why we want to let the new generation, the kids that are in school now, to teach them the real story, truth-telling. Thank you.
Thank you, Aniame. We have gone over time. I need to remind you that you can watch the Australian Wars series on SBS on demand. And I'm also conscious that I need to still hand over to Marek to do the closing statements. But please join me in once again thanking our very distinguished panel. Marek, do you want to just close it up?
I'm going to stand next to you, Melitta. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much for this really incredible and quite emotional discussion and conversation that we had tonight. I'm going to speak as a kindergarten teacher and I'm going to speak as a dean of the faculty. I think that all these knowledges, there are for all educators and for all children, all young people. They are incredibly important and incredible truths that are really important to be told. And we have a profound responsibility as educators to teach Indigenous histories, to teach the truth, to tell these stories about Australian wars and colonial violence. And I don't see it as a choice. I see it as an ethical obligation that we have. And that requires potentially courage, that requires care, and that requires commitment to justice. And that's very important. That's what we heard tonight. I also think that storytelling is a really powerful tool that sort of we can use to tell this truth-telling. And that's very evident, Rachel, from your documentary, from your work, how much it impacts, how it can be told, how it can be shared. But I also hope that the conversation won't stop here and won't stop tonight. We have a responsibility to reshape the future, not only the history. We need to do it for the future, for our children, for children of our children. Is this, from my perspective, our own nation-building exercise that we need to do to tell the story and to become part of Australia's national consciousness by telling these stories. So where do we go from here? From my perspective, as a Dean of the Faculty of Education, we must continue to question, to unlearn, and to relearn these stories. We must really ensure that the Indigenous perspectives are embedded across all levels of education. We cannot be determined by the levels of education. We need to tell the truth. And above all, we must listen. We must listen to each other. We must listen to Indigenous people. We must listen to elders. We must listen to these stories. We need to take them seriously. Only then begin to continue and to ground the future and to really become grounded in truth, respect, and reconciliation. This truth-telling cannot be a single moment. It must be a lifelong commitment that we do. And thank you so much, Marcia, Rachel, Belinda, Bill, and Melitta, for being such an amazing panel and reminding us of these really fundamental, key truths that we have here. So thank you. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our panelists. And of course, we have here, I know some of you must leave, but we have here some gifts that we wanted to give, and they are from Kaila Arts, which is our vibrant community-owned hub by the First Nations Creativity and Cultural Expression, which is located on Yota country in Shepparton, Victoria. And thank you so much to everybody who is engaged. We need to finish, obviously, but I just want to say thanks for everybody. I can't name everyone who is involved in making this happen, but thank you for being here. You can watch the recording, watch the Australian Wars, and please do come again and join us again in this conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being tonight.
Wow, that was an amazing discussion with some great advice. And you can find those Culture is Life resources to start using in your classroom on the Hey History website. That's heyhistory.net. That's it for this 8-part professional development series, Hey History Teacher. We hope you enjoyed listening and feel more equipped to teach history in your primary and secondary classroom. We've all got a passion for history teaching, and it'd be great to be able to continue the conversation. So get in touch, reach out, and share this with your friends and colleagues. We'd love to hear what you think too, so please send us through an email on our website, heyhistory.net. This episode and the whole professional development series is funded by the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. Special thanks to Jonathan Dallimore. Hey History Teacher is produced by Jane Curtis at UTS Impact Studios. The executive producer of this series is Anna Clark. This podcast was made on Gadigal country in Sydney, Australia. Thanks for listening.